Every morning, Arthur Bennett unlocked the same tiny watch shop. People came in with broken watches. They complained about his slow hands. They joked that an old man shouldn't need 30 minutes just to open a watch. What none of them knew was that those same hands had once been trusted with secrets that could never be written down. For years, Arthur had worked in a world where one tiny mistake could expose an entire operation. And when the truth finally came out, the people who had called him just an old watchmaker couldn't believe what they were looking at. Arthur Bennett was 74 years old, and every morning at 8 o'clock sharp, he unlocked the door of Bennett's, a narrow little shop on Main Street in Fairview, watches ticking on every wall, more clocks than customers most days. He worked slowly, deliberately. A magnifying loupe pressed into one eye socket, tweezers moving in increments most people couldn't even see happening. "Are you sure you still have the eyesight for this?" a young customer named Ryan Sutter asked one afternoon, watching Arthur turn a single screw for what felt like an eternity. Arthur just smiled without looking up. "I've had worse days," he said. It became something of a running joke around Fairview, the old watchmaker who took 30 minutes just to open a case back. "It shouldn't take that long to fix a watch," customers muttered, more than once, loud enough for him to hear. Some regulars had started taking their watches 2 towns over instead, to a bigger shop with faster turnaround and younger hands behind the counter. Arthur never tried to talk them out of it. A few customers, waiting too long in the small shop, took to reading the old newspaper clippings pinned haphazardly near the register. Not about Arthur, just local weather records and church bake sale results. Anything to pass the time while he worked. Nobody knew that his slowness wasn't age. It wasn't even really about the watches. Every single time a customer handed him a piece to repair, Arthur ran through the same private ritual, whether he needed to or not. The case back first, then the hands, then the strap, then the movement itself, then every number on the face, every scratch, every detail most people would never think twice about. It was a habit 40 years old. He'd simply never found a reason to stop. At home, in the apartment above the shop, Arthur kept a small metal toolbox on his nightstand. Not watchmaking tools, but older ones, worn smooth, that he hadn't opened in decades. Most nights, before bed, he still checked that the lock on the toolbox was fastened, out of a habit even he couldn't fully explain anymore. One Thursday afternoon, an older man named Gerald Hollis came in, carrying a watch that had belonged to his father. Old, dented, the leather strap cracked with age. Arthur took one look at it, turned it once in his palm, and went very still. He didn't say anything, not yet. The watch belonged to Gerald's father, who had passed away the previous winter. Gerald didn't know much about its history, just that his father had kept it in a drawer for as long as he could remember, never worn, never explained. "Where did he get it?" Arthur asked, turning the watch over slowly in his hands. "No idea," Gerald admitted. "Family thing, I guess. He never talked about it much." Arthur opened the case back, the way he'd opened thousands of casebacks before, but this time, his hands slowed even further than usual. Behind the movement, tucked into a space that should have held nothing at all, sat a small, precisely cut compartment, empty now, but unmistakably deliberate. Not a manufacturing flaw, not damage, a modification, made by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. Arthur had seen that exact style of compartment before, a very long time ago, in a very different life. He closed the watch, set it gently on the counter, and looked at Gerald for a long moment. "I don't think I should repair this," he said. "Why not?" Gerald asked, confused. Arthur just looked at the watch, not at Gerald, when he answered. "Some things are better left untouched." After Gerald left, Arthur stood alone behind the counter for a long moment, both hands flat on the glass case, staring at nothing in particular. It was the first time in nearly 20 years that his old world had reached into his new one, uninvited. Gerald never did get the watch repaired anywhere else. It went back into a drawer, the same as it had sat for decades before he'd ever brought it in. Gerald mentioned the strange exchange to a few people around town over the following days, the story spreading the way small-town stories do, a little more curious with every retelling. It was one of those retellings that eventually reached a young reporter named Emily Carter, who wrote for the Fairview Weekly and had a habit of noticing when a simple story didn't quite add up. Emily Carter had covered Fairview's town council meetings, its county fair ribbons, and its occasional fender bender for 3 years. A watchmaker cryptically refusing to fix a watch was, by local standards, a genuine mystery. She started simply, asking around, checking what public records existed. There wasn't much. No social media. No old photographs anyone in Fairview had ever seen. Just a single line in the county business registry. Arthur Bennett, watch repair, 1989 to present. Nothing before that. Nothing at all. Emily kept digging anyway, the way reporters do when a silence feels louder than an answer would. She spent an evening searching digitized newspaper archives for the name Arthur Bennett, filtering by date, by state, by anything she could think of. She cross-referenced what little she could find against retirement announcements, old census records, anything with a date attached. Most nights, she came up with nothing more than she'd started with. Most results were dead ends, other men, other decades, nothing that fit. Then, in a scanned 1974 photograph accompanying an old wire story about a government building dedication, she found it. A group of 12 men in dark suits, standing stiffly for the camera, most of them unnamed in the caption. In the far corner of the photo, barely in frame, stood a young man, maybe in his early 20s, sharp-eyed, unsmiling. Emily zoomed in as far as the scan would allow. It was Arthur. She sat with the photo for a long time before she did anything else. She didn't publish a word. She printed the photo, put it in an envelope, and drove to the watch shop the next morning, not as a reporter chasing a story, but as someone who thought Arthur deserved to be asked directly, rather than exposed. Arthur looked at the photograph for a long time before he said anything. Then he set it face down on the counter and, for the first time in over 20 years, he told someone the truth, carefully, and only in the shape he was willing to give it. "I wasn't a spy," he said. "Whatever you're picturing, put it away. I never carried a gun. I never chased anyone through an airport." For the better part of 2 decades, Arthur explained, he had worked for a U.S. intelligence agency, not in the field, but in a small technical division most people never think exists. His job was to examine devices, often ordinary-looking ones, that were used to move information without anyone noticing, modified timepieces among them, engineered to carry messages, signals, sometimes nothing more than proof that a meeting had actually happened. Arthur's specific gift was noticing what didn't belong, a gear tooth off by a fraction of a millimeter, a weight distribution wrong by less than a gram, the difference between a genuine device and a compromised one, hiding inside details so small that almost nobody else was trained to see them. He described it once, simply, to Emily. Everyone else was looking at the second hand. I was the only one looking at the screw holding it in place. One wrong read, Arthur said, and a person on the other side of the world could disappear. That's not a metaphor. That's just what the job was. He never used the word hero. He was careful about that, almost pointedly so. "I wasn't the one taking the risks out there," he said. "I was just the one making sure the small things were telling the truth." The compartment in Gerald's father's watch, Arthur admitted, was almost certainly the same kind of modification he used to inspect for a living. Though whose it had been, or what it had once carried, wasn't something he could tell Emily, or anyone. Some answers, he said again, were better left where they were. When Emily finally did write the story, with Arthur's permission and none of the details he'd asked her to leave out, Fairview reacted the way small towns do to something too large to fully process at once. People reread the article twice. Some drove past the shop just to look at it differently. What the article couldn't fully capture was what those 2 decades had actually cost him. Arthur's wife, Helen, had married him 3 years into his career, and for nearly all the decades that followed, all she ever really knew was what she wrote, once, on an old anniversary card. "To the man who works for the government, whatever that means today." She'd learned, early on, not to ask questions he couldn't answer. Not out of hurt, exactly. More a kind of quiet accommodation 2 people build together, when one of them is carrying something the other isn't allowed to hold. There had been, Arthur admitted once to Emily, exactly 1 year, he wouldn't say which, when the work had nearly cost him everything at home anyway, secrets or not. He didn't elaborate further, and Emily didn't ask him to. Their son, David, grew up assuming his father had one of the most boring jobs in Washington. Some unnamed desk, some unnamed department. He moved out west after college, called on holidays, and for years, quietly resented a father he felt he'd never fully met. Long before Arthur ever repaired a customer's watch, he'd been quietly repairing his own, late at night, in the small apartment he and Helen shared. Not because anything was broken, but because it was the only work he was ever allowed to talk about out loud, even just to himself. When Arthur finally left the agency, he didn't take another government job, didn't consult, didn't write a memoir nobody would be allowed to read anyway. He opened a watch shop instead. Because for the first time in his adult life, every single thing he did, every screw, every spring, every small correction, could be seen, checked, and understood by anyone who cared to look. When Emily's article ran, David called his father for the first time in months, not about the CIA, not really, but to ask, quietly, what his mother had known and hadn't known, and whether either of them had ever been angry about it. "Your mother never once asked me a question I couldn't answer honestly," Arthur told him. That was its own kind of extraordinary. I don't think I ever thanked her properly for it. Helen, when she read the article herself, didn't seem surprised so much as quietly relieved, as if a door she'd never tried to open had finally been unlocked from the other side, gently and entirely on his own terms. The following spring, David flew back to Fairview for the first time in 3 years, ostensibly to see the shop everyone online was talking about. He stayed for 11 days. Ryan Sutter, the young customer who'd once asked if Arthur still had the eyesight for the job, came back to the shop a few weeks later, watch in hand, though this one wasn't actually broken. "Why did you become a watchmaker?" Ryan finally asked, the question he'd apparently been sitting on since the article ran. Arthur looked up at the watches lining every wall of the shop, dozens of them, all ticking slightly out of sync with one another, filling the small room with a soft, constant murmur. "Because after spending a lifetime keeping secrets," he said, "I wanted to spend the rest of mine fixing things people could actually see." Ryan didn't have much to say back to that. He just nodded, and for the first time, didn't rush Arthur through anything. Not long after, a boy from town named Miles, 11 years old, started stopping by the shop after school, first just to watch, then to ask questions, then, eventually, to hold the tweezers himself under Arthur's careful direction. Arthur taught him the same way he'd once been taught himself, decades earlier, by an old instructor whose name he still wasn't allowed to say out loud. Patience first, precision second, and the rest, eventually, would follow on its own. Arthur never once told Miles he needed a successor. He wasn't trying to pass down a name, or a secret, or a legacy anyone would remember him for. He just wanted someone else in Fairview to know how to look closely enough to notice what everyone else walked straight past. Arthur still opens the shop at 8 o'clock sharp every morning. He still takes his time with every watch that comes through the door. Case back first, then the hands, then the strap, then the movement, exactly the way he always has. The next time you see an old man sitting quietly behind a repair counter, don't assume his life has always been ordinary. Sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones who have spent a lifetime carrying stories they were never allowed to tell. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. There's a new hidden hero story every week.